Hello. Okay, here we go. So this is your annual waste training or your annual RCRA training, and we'll go through what that stands for. It'll make more sense, and you'll understand why whenever I'm saying RCRA, it'll all come together. So here we go. So the course goals, basically understanding the different types of waste, what makes a waste hazardous versus non-hazardous, how a waste disposal document should be filled out and fully completed, the proper ways to label waste containers, inspecting waste management areas, responding to releases of waste, and the regulatory requirements for employees like yourself who participate in all or some of the management of the waste steps. So we'll go through all of this, and I have shortened this presentation. Originally, it was like 3-4 hours long, and I gave it at a breast implant manufacturing facility, so that was interesting. But this will probably be like 30 minutes long, and there will be points where I'll say at the end, towards the end, that you'll need to watch the videos that I've sent y'all. So make sure you actually take the time to watch the videos because they're pretty helpful. So the first part we're going to go through are the characteristics of waste. So basically what makes waste hazardous for various different things, what makes waste non-hazardous, and so on and so forth. Basically my thought process is when y'all bring waste back to your yard and you're giving me a description of that waste, these are all the steps that I go through to classify the waste. So this will kind of help you understand why I ask the questions that I ask. So this is the waste flow chart. So generally how waste is broken down. Obviously we got our two big categories, hazardous versus non-hazardous. And then those are further broken down. For hazardous, it's listed waste. So you've got those crazy looking letters F, K, P, and U. And then characteristic waste, which that's most of the haz we deal with is ignitability. So it's flammable, reactivity, stuff that's reactive with water and whatnot. Corrosivity, so corrosive waste, and toxicity, which would be for like heavy metals and stuff. And then the other category is non-hazardous. And if you're in Colorado, literally there's none of that breakdown right there. There is industrial versus non-industrial, but there's none of that class 1, class 2, class 3. That's a Texas thing. Just FYI. So first of all, waste identification and classification. Generators are responsible for characterizing their waste as hazardous, and they must determine whether a waste exhibits a characteristic by either testing it or applying knowledge of the hazardous waste characteristics of the waste. So basically testing versus process knowledge, and we'll go through what those are specifically. So process knowledge is basically your describing a waste and classifying it just because you know exactly, where it came from, what went into that waste. So that would be, very helpful when you have safety data sheets, or you've got relatively simple waste streams. So let's say you've got an unused product waste. It's some type of chemical that a company's never used and they want us to dispose of it. I could generally just profile that based off process knowledge and that safety data sheet because we know there's nothing else that's gone into it. There's no other contaminants. So that kind of stuff's pretty easy. Basically, I would just need a description of the activities that generate that waste and identification of potential contaminants. And usually I'll let y'all know, if we discuss it, how it was generated, and the potential contaminants. It may be a point where I'll say, oh, no, I need testing on that, if the process gets too complex. So this is an example of a waste profile that I have to fill out when I'm profiling something into Turkey Creek. So this is in Alvarado. They are actually owned by Waste Connections. So that's why it says that at the top. So this is a completed waste profile. The first part, you can see I've listed the generator, the address of where it came from, where it's going, so Turkey Creek, and the transporter. So I put us there, CG Environmental, obviously. And this is a profile for sewage, bleach, soil, and rinse water. So it makes me go through and describe the materials. So it asked me if it was an industrial waste stream, and I said no. What's the common name? Sewage, bleach, soil, and rinse water. And then it asked me to break it down in the general process description. So as a result of a broken sewage line, sewage discharged upon the concrete roadway and the soil. As a result of the spill cleanup, the waste generated includes 2 drums of sewage, bleach, soil, and rinse water. This is a non-industrial, non-hazardous Class 2 waste. And we'll go through what makes it a Class 2 waste when we look at the analytical. So it asked me for sources of contamination. I said sewage and bleach. Material composition, so the constituents, versus the soil versus the sewage, bleach, rinse water. So you can see the percentages there, and that's just a general estimate. Color, brownish. Physical state, I said sludge. Free liquid range, 30 to 40%. pH, it asked for odor, reactivity, which I said no on all those because it didn't really stink and it was not reactive. And then the flash point is NA because obviously the poopy water is not going to flash. And then on it goes into more. This is the regulatory section. So it asked me, is this a hazardous waste? And I say no. And you can see that I have checked analytical on that one. And that's how we determined that it was non-hazardous. Turkey Creek, a lot of the landfills will require testing on sewage, apparently. Apparently there's been some cases of heavy metals in the sewage waste, which I've seen firsthand, which seems kind of weird, but it is a thing. It'll come back as for lead or something like that. So in this case, I wasn't using process knowledge because the landfill will not accept that. So I was using analytical. Process knowledge would be okay in the case of, let's say, diesel and soil. I could say it was from a vehicular accident on the roadway, diesel was spilled from the saddle tank, and now we've got, soil impacted with diesel. And if I include an SDS, that is sufficient process knowledge for the landfill to approve this profile. But in this case, with the sewage and the soil, they do require testing. Process knowledge is not acceptable. So, and there's a bunch of other questions it asked me on here, and you can see most of them are going to be no, or all of them are going to be no. Otherwise, Turkey Creek wouldn't be able to take it. So, and then here you can see it asked me the estimated annual quantity. I said 2 drums, the container type it's in, metal open top, and then the US DOT shipping name, which in this case would be non-hazardous, non-DOT regulated waste, sewage, rinse water, bleach, soil. It's going to be class 2. So, and I'll show you the analytical later that I actually went through. And for one moment, let me make sure that this is actually recording and that I'm not just continuing to talk. I think it's recording. I think so. It should be. Okay, anyways. So, as you can see, for that profile, I had to use analytical testing. And that's what this next section goes into, is how we're classifying the waste. I had to use analytical testing on that sewage because the landfill requires it. But like I said, for example, if it was diesel and soil, they don't require any testing on that. So we'd be okay just using an SDS and using that process knowledge and just describing the situation and how that waste was generated. But a lot of the times, analytical testing is required, and it really is the most surefire way to classify a waste. So if a generator uses analytical data to classify a waste, the data must be supported by documentation of the sampling procedure and the analytical testing. So things like dates of the sample, description of where it was taken, the method and equipment used for sampling, and a sampling plan, which would be in more severe circumstances. Most of the time, it's just us sampling from a drum. So all of this information is included on your chain of custody when you're pulling a sample. So, it's not too hard of information. Basically, when did you pull the sample? What time was it? The day, and stuff like that. It's pretty simple. So we've gone through the 2 ways to classify waste, and that's the analytical testing, which is a surefire way to classify, or the process knowledge, which is acceptable in a limited number of circumstances. Not all circumstances are okay with process knowledge. If you've got a manufacturing facility and it's got a bunch of crazy wastes, and a bunch of crazy chemicals that are going in there, really, you're going to have to test that. So that's just a conversation that the account reps have to have with me when we bring waste back to the yard, and why I will badger, the techs and ops, how a waste was generated, because I'm trying to figure out, is this okay for process knowledge, or do we need to pull a sample? Okay, so back to the waste flow chart, we're going to break down the 2 categories of hazardous waste. So we're going to jump into listed waste, and this is going to be a little bit weird. We're going to run through these quickly because most of the time our wastes are going to be characteristic waste, so they're going to be flammable, reactive, corrosive, or toxic. But occasionally we will have an industrial customer who's doing stuff like, plating of different, vehicular parts or aerospace parts. They may have, an acid line they're dipping stuff in, and this and that. And that would really be when we deal with listed waste. And I would let you know when we're dealing with that type of waste. So listed hazardous wastes are certain wastes that have been pre-designed or pre-designated, that should be pre-designated as hazardous. So under RCRA, that's Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, basically those are the rules that govern all waste in the United States. So when you hear me say RCRA, like I said before, that's basically referring to the regulations that cover all types of waste. So RCRA, waste regulations, is basically what they equate to. So if a waste appears on one of the four lists that the EPA has designated, F, K, P, or U, then it's automatically considered to be a hazardous waste. So even if it's, something that may not be ignitable, it may not be corrosive, and it may not be toxic or reactive, but if it's on these specific lists that the EPA has put out, then it's considered a listed hazardous waste. And the big thing with listed wastes are if you put a drop of that, let's say you accidentally put that waste in oily water, well, now the entire oily water load is considered hazardous waste, considered listed hazardous waste. And basically what that means is it's going to be super duper expensive to dispose of. So if you see me ever tell you this is a listed hazardous waste, and you see F, K, P, and U listed anywhere, then you know you need to be very, very careful with this waste, and you need to make sure it stays segregated. Whether that's putting in its own tote, its own drum, it could be anything related to listed waste, whether it's rinse water, PPE, absorbents, any of it. If it touches a listed hazardous waste, then all of it's listed hazardous waste. So, basically just something to pay attention to. If you hear those words, then make sure that you're very careful with how you manage that when you bring it back to your yard. But like I said, we don't deal with a whole lot of those. That's really only here and there. And I will be very irritating and vehement about it if that ever happens. And so you won't forget, and just put it that way. The next portion of hazardous waste that we deal with more on a routine basis is the characteristic hazardous waste. So this is stuff that everybody's familiar with. Ignitable waste, so it's got, a low flash point. Reactive waste, it can release fumes and off gas and all sorts of things if it's, in contact with water. So there's various different examples for that. Corrosivity, so if it's corrosive, if it's an acid or base, and toxicity. So that's heavy metals like lead. We'll run through that kind of some more examples. So even if the waste stream does not meet any of those four explained previously, so that F, K, and P listing, obviously can still be considered a hazardous waste if it exhibits these characteristics. So the EPA has designated the following four characteristics. You've got ignitable waste, so it's flammable. Corrosive waste, as you can see in that picture, it's going to eat through that metal. Reactivity, so that drum over there exploding. And then toxic, which I'm not sure what that whirlwind is coming out of the hole, but that's any of the heavy metals, and we'll go through that. So the first one, ignitability. Ignitable wastes create fires under certain conditions or are spontaneously combustible or have a flash point less than 140 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's the biggest thing, is if you're ever looking at an SDS and you see it says flash point and it's like 100 or 120 or 65, then you know that that's an ignitable hazardous waste. It also includes waste that meet the definition of an oxidizer. So those are all things I'm looking for when you guys send me an SDS or tell me a product name. When I look up the SDS, I'm looking to see, is this an oxidizer? Does it have a flash point less than 140 degrees Fahrenheit? And if it does, then what we tack on there is D001. That is an EPA hazardous waste number that indicates that you've got a flammable hazardous waste. So if you're ever filling out a manifest and you see on there D001, then okay, we know that it's going to be flammable hazardous waste. So the next one is corrosivity. So we deal with this one a lot, obviously, with a lot of our acids and bases. So if you have a pH that's less than 2.5, or if it's over 12.5, then it's going to be considered a hazardous waste for corrosivity. So those are the two biggest things on there. Greater than 12.5, hazardous. It's corrosive. It's basic. Less than 2.5, it's hazardous. It's corrosive. It's acidic. So it would carry that D002 code, which these codes are all just indicators to the disposal facility, both on the profile and the manifest, that once it gets into their hands, they can immediately look at that code and say, oh, D002, that's corrosive. The next kind is reactivity. So these are reactive wastes that are unstable under normal conditions. So they can cause an explosion, release toxic fumes or gases or vapors when mixed with water. So like lithium sulfur batteries and explosives, those are all considered reactive type waste. They're hazardous. But batteries are actually universal waste, and we'll talk about that later. It's a special category of hazardous waste where they kind of made the rules easier for generators to manage their waste, where they don't have to classify it as hazardous. But like I said, if it's something that has an explosion threat or toxic fumes, gases, vapors, and mixed with water, then it's going to carry this code, D003. So once again, that's an indicator to us and to the disposal facility. When they see that code right there, they'll say, okay, this is reactive. So we need to be careful, it's a hazardous waste. And then the fourth category of a characteristic hazardous waste is toxicity. So toxic wastes are harmful or fatal when ingested or absorbed. So it could contain mercury, lead, etc. So when toxic wastes are disposed of on land, that contaminated liquid could drain or leach from the waste and pollute the groundwater. So that right there is why we can't take this kind of stuff to the landfill. You know, if I tested that poopy water earlier for metals, like we talked about, like the landfill requires, and it came back hazardous for lead, well, it can't go to the landfill. It's a toxic hazardous waste now. And it would have to go to Clean Harbors or U.S. Ecology or through Green Planet to those disposal facilities, some type of deal, because it's hazardous waste. So toxicity is defined through a laboratory procedure called toxicity characteristic leaching procedure. That's called TCLIP. So if you hear me say, oh, we're doing TCLIP testing, TCLIP metals, that's what we're doing, is basically trying to see, is this a toxic waste? Is this a toxic hazardous waste? And that's the testing that we do for that. As you can see, the EPA hazardous waste numbers range through D004 to D043. So there's a lot of different categories of hazardous waste under toxicity. And it basically goes through all the metals, through all of our volatile organic chemicals, you know, benzene and stuff like that. So that's what toxicity covers, is a much wider range of hazardous types of waste. So yeah, that's what the testing is very helpful for, is determining, is this hazardous waste, is it toxic waste? And this right here is a chart that I use. It was made by Waste Management. So this is just an example. There's a lot of these out here that, you know, give you your regulatory levels, but I think this one's the most helpful when you're actually looking at the chart. So as you can see, under EPA hazardous regulatory levels, that first, you know, two rows, you can see it says TCLIP in total. Those are basically just, you know, which tests that you're doing. So if I do TCLIP testing on, let's say, that sewage and water, I would go through and look at all of these levels here once I get my analytical back and see if it exceeds any of these. So you can see that first one says arsenic. It's at 5.0. So I would look at my analytical and let's say it's at 10.0. Well, then I know I've got hazardous waste for arsenic, and it would carry that D004 code, which is right next to the arsenic in that first row on the EPA number. So basically, this is the chart that I compare all of our analytical to make sure it's not hazardous. So, but we'll go back to this later. Oh, look, no, here it is. Okay, so on the left is a piece of the analytical from the sewage, bleach, rinse water, soil. Basically this right here, it says metals. So it did arsenic, barium, cadmium, chromium, lead, selenium, and silver. That's what it tested for here. You can see our result. So basically what I'll do is take those numbers and compare it to the chart over on the right side. So arsenic says ND, which is for non-detect, which is a good thing. That means there was none detected, so we're good there. Barium says 0.444. Well, we go over to the right side, barium, under TCLIP, it says the hazardous waste limit is 100, which obviously 0.44 is way under that. And then if you look at all the other numbers, cadmium, chromium, lead, selenium, silver, those are all non-detect. So, you know, this is hazardous waste, so yippee, we're good. Here's an example of not non-hazardous waste. This is hazardous waste for sure. So if you look at like our lead levels here, we've got 1,090. And if you go back and look over here on the right side, which was lead, and I did this in totals rather than T-clip, just the unit difference. So if you look at lead, it says 100 milligrams per kilogram. Well, our lead over here is 1090 milligrams per kilogram. So this waste is super hazardous for lead. So this would be a type of waste that would have to go to Clean Harbors for disposal because it's hazardous waste. If you look at like nickel, I don't think that's listed on here. Oh, nickel. So it says NA, not applicable. So in this case, copper and nickel, although our values are pretty high, they're not on an EPA toxicity list. So while they may cause a problem for treatment when we take it to Clean Harbors, it doesn't make it hazardous waste. What makes it hazardous waste here is that lead. And in this case, this was actually a deal where somebody did one of those We Buy homes. There were some drums left on the property. They didn't know what they were. They ended up spilling them, and they ended up having to do multiple excavations, multiple rounds of testing. And I'm not even sure what their situation is now because this lady couldn't even pay for it. But in the case of this, like I said, lead was hazardous, and copper is not something, if you look over here, it's not on the list of toxic metals. However, because it was so high, Clean Harbors ended up charging us a bunch more because it made it more difficult to treat in their incinerators. So while that copper and nickel don't really contribute to the, classifying this as hazardous waste, they still made that treatment more difficult. So these are all things that I'm looking at when I'm reviewing these analytical results and, breaking it down when the account reps will come to me and ask how much this waste is going to cost for disposal. Well, these are all things I'm taking into consideration. So basically this list over here on the right is the most applicable though, and it's really what I'm looking at when we're trying to classify hazardous versus non-hazardous. Okay, so now we'll jump to non-hazardous waste, which is really the bulk of what we deal with. Like I said, Colorado does not have this breakdown of class 1, 2, and 3. In Colorado, it's either non-hazardous or hazardous. In Texas, for whatever reason, we've made up our own special rules, and we do break down waste into class 1, class 2, and class 3. And that really comes into importance when I'm profiling waste to the landfills, because in order to accept class 1 waste, which we'll go through examples of that, the landfills have to have special cells, which means where they're dumping the waste. It has special liners. There's more special things that go along with class 1 wastes than there are class 2 wastes. So we'll break all that down, but you'll see the importance of why I ask certain questions to see, is this class 1 or class 2? Because not all landfills have class 1 cells. So we'll explain that a little bit more. We'll go through non-industrial versus industrial. Industrial wastes result from operations of industry, manufacturing, mining, or agriculture. This is, companies like PVI or Tico Westinghouse, just to name two examples of facilities that are manufacturing, like Lockheed Martin would be a manufacturing facility, anything like that where they're manufacturing something. Non-industrial stuff like our gas stations, dry cleaners, laboratories, anything that's serving the public. And a lot of our customers are non-industrial. So like a lot of the truckers, those accidents that we clean up for Roar Jorgensen or TxDOT or anything like that, those are going to be non-industrial wastes most of the time. But you don't really have to worry about that as much. I mainly worry about that, and we'll explain a little bit later why I would be concerned with that. So class 1 waste. Class 1 waste is considered potentially threatening to human health and the environment if not properly managed because of its constituents and properties that the class can include. So this would be like waste that have a flash point above 140 but below 150. So remember, we talked about ignitability is below 140 degrees Fahrenheit. If it's between 140 to 150 and we judge that from an SDS or analytical testing, then it's going to be class 1. So it has to go into a special cell. And the biggest example of class 1 wastes are going to be solids contaminated with over 1,500 parts per million hydrocarbons. So that's going to be like diesel in soil, hydraulic oil in soil, even gas in soil. If we come back with testing that shows it's not hazardous for benzene or flashpoint, but it has, 2,000 parts per million hydrocarbons, it's class 1. So this is most of what we send to Turkey Creek, to Tessman, to Covell Gardens, majority of our wastes that we deal with are going to be class 1. So, for example, that's why we can't send, without testing, diesel and soil to Waste Management Austin, is because they can't accept anything that's class 1, only class 2. So just more considerations, and why I need SDS sheets, why we need analytical testing is to figure out, okay, where can we send this? Who can accept this class 1 waste? Class 2 and class 3, these are the most non-hazardous. These are the, pretty benign stuff. So we're looking at latex and water-based paints, cooking oils, and, food grease. Those are the biggest example or most common examples of class 2 waste. Which, also for another example, I guess, would be the sewage and the rinse water that we tested earlier for the metals. Well, that came back all non-haz. There was nothing hazardous there. It doesn't have high hydrocarbons, over that 1,500 parts per million. So it'll be class 2. Most landfills can take class 2 waste. So we like it when it's class 2 because it's easy disposal. Class 3 wastes are materials like demolition debris, so like bricks, wood, stuff that's insoluble and doesn't react with any other materials and does not decompose. So there you go. Now we're going to kind of delve into a whole nother group of types of waste. So this is all types of waste that don't fall into the hazardous characteristic or listed, or non-hazardous, class 1, class 2, class 3. So the first example is going to be used oil. So used oil is any oil. I'm so sorry, my bird. Any oil that was refined from crude oil or any synthetic oil, and it's used, and as a result of such is contaminated by physical or chemical impurities. So used oil and waste oil are not always interchangeable terms. But rarely do I see anyone say they have waste oil. Most of the time it's used oil or it's unused, oil product that we're going to send off for recycle. So this is anything that we would send to Midstate or Valacor or up in Colorado that we would, when your all's tanks fill up with airvac services, that kind of stuff. So the biggest thing to remember is what's used oil versus what's not used oil. So you can see there's a pretty long list of what's included in used oil. We've got transmission fluids, brake fluids, power steering fluids, hydraulic oil, car greases, diesel engine crankcase oil. But what's not used oil is used animal or vegetable oils, unused, contaminated or uncontaminated oils going for reclamation, solid waste contaminated with used oil that are not burned for energy recovery and don't have free-flowing oil. So that'd be, for example, when we pick up like hydraulic oil and absorbents that we've done on roadside cleanup, and we plan on sending that to the landfill, that's not considered used oil. So, there's a difference there. Let's say we decided to send those absorbents and used oil to Midstate for recycle, or or Clean Harbors for recycle, then now those absorbents are considered used oil and they have to be managed under used oil rules, which we'll go through here in a minute. It's actually, I don't know why they do this, but they actually make it more difficult and more stringent to manage used oil related wastes, which are being recycled, which one would think is a good thing. It's actually more difficult to manage them like that than it would be to manage them as solid wastes, which would be like if we took it to the landfill, which we'll get into that later, what exactly the difference is between those two management options, depending on how we classify it. Not used oil, so once again, solvents, mineral spirits, acetone, alcohols, paint thinners, used antifreeze, animal greases, like we said, which I see that a lot. People accidentally put, used animal fat, animal oils in with used oil. And I'm like, okay, that's not used oil. Don't put it in there. So, you just really have to pay attention to what you're putting into your oily water, what you're classifying as used oil, because you don't want to screw up a whole load by, putting in some paint with your used oil, because that's not used oil. Can't be recycled the same. So it's just important to pay attention to what you're actually adding to your used oil, because it really may not be considered oily water or used oil. Okay, so here's where we get into the used oil storage and management. So used oil can only be stored in containers and tanks that are in good condition. And any containers, tanks, whatever, that hold used oil or oily water that's going for recycle like we do, it has to be labeled as used oil, and it has to be sitting in secondary containment. So if you bring back a drum of oily water, you better have it labeled as used oil, and you better have it sitting in containment, because if an inspector shows up, then we're going to have a problem and we're going to get a violation, because now we've got used oil sitting outside of a secondary containment. So really pay attention to, if you're bringing back used oil, if you're bringing back oily water, it has to be in containment and it has to be labeled as used oil. And the same goes for oily absorbents. Let's say I'm telling you, hey, we're going to send those oily absorbents to Midstate or Valacor. It's going for recycle, which means it has to be managed under used oil rules. However, if I say, that hydraulic oil and absorbents are going to the landfill, like Turkey Creek or Testman or Waste Management, then we don't have to have it in secondary containment. We don't have to label it as used oil. It's actually easier to send this stuff to the landfill than it is to send it for recycle, which is strange to me. I think you'd want to encourage people to recycle it, but those are the rules. So just pay attention to where I tell you it's getting sent, and if I'm asking for certain things, management-wise, this is why. So used oil filters. Used oil filters obviously should be put in leak-proof, tightly sealed containers, and they need to be labeled as used oil filters. Used oil absorbents, this just reiterates what I just said. So absorbent materials with signs of free-flowing oil are going to be managed as used oil. If there are no visible signs of free-flowing oil, and these materials are not going to be regulated as used oil unless we're burning them for energy recovery. So that would be in the case if we send them to Midstate/Valacor for recycle, they have to be labeled as used oil. If they're going to be disposed of in a landfill, then it's considered solid waste. So the state categorizes these petroleum contaminated materials as special waste when we're taking them to the landfill. So you don't have to label it as used oil. You don't have to have it in containment. You would just put non-hazardous solid waste, absorbents contaminated with hydraulic oil. But if you're taking it for recycle, put it as used oil, put it in containment. Use antifreeze. It's not considered a hazardous waste unless it's been mixed with something like a solvent or whatever. If it's not just straight used antifreeze or coolant, then we'll have to figure out, do we need to test it, process knowledge, whatever, like we discussed earlier. So majority of the time when we send stuff antifreeze off, it's recycled. So you want to label that as used antifreeze. It does not have to sit in containment though. The next big section we're going to talk about, and I'm sure most of you have heard me talk about this, are universal wastes. So basically what the EPA did is they classified certain things as universal waste to encourage recycling. So recycling of batteries, mercury-containing equipment like thermometers, certain pesticides, and lamps, which is bulbs. So the universal waste program is less stringent than the full hazardous waste regulations. So they did this really, like I said, to encourage people to recycle, to encourage people, to make it easier on businesses to recycle this stuff and manage it responsibly. So EPA established standards in 1995 for 3 types of universal waste: batteries, pesticides, and thermostats. And then later they ended up adding hazardous waste lamps to that list of universal waste. So that's any of the bulbs. And then later they added mercury containing equipment. So that would be like any of the thermometers and stuff like that. Management requirements, just pretty typical stuff. They all should be closed tightly. If you have any spills or releases, you must contain it. We can't store these materials longer than a year if we've generated it ourselves. If we pick it up from a customer, it should not really, it should not be on our yard for longer than 30 days. There's really no reason for it to be longer. We have 90 days to have it on site, but it should not be longer than 30 days. There's no reason for that. And the biggest thing is that we have to be able to demonstrate the length of time that we've had that universal waste. So if you pick up a drum from a customer of bulbs, then you need to have a universal waste label on there. It needs to be completely filled out, and you need to have the date on there that you picked it up. So if you picked it up yesterday, then you need to have yesterday's date on there. Because if an inspector shows up, they're going to say, how long have you had this? And if it's already all on the label, then there you go. It's a very easy situation. And if something happens and somebody didn't write the date on there, then they're going to ask to see your BOL. And you'll have to pull your BOL out and show them we've only had it for this certain amount of time. So some of the advantages to universal waste, and really why they put this into place, is we don't have to have a manifest when transporting universal waste. So with hazardous waste, normally you have to have a manifest. Well, in the case of these universal wastes, you don't, which makes it easy. Just put it on a BOL. It doesn't count towards these generators and their hazardous waste generator status. So, they may have 5 drums of bulbs. They may have at one point counted as hazardous waste, if they've got like lead acid batteries. Well, now it doesn't because it's under these universal waste rules. So it's really helpful with fees and stuff like that. And they can keep it on site longer. So really it's a bigger benefit to the generators than it really is to us. And I guess the biggest thing with universal waste and why it's easier for us is we can put it on a BOL. Okay, we'll kind of go through the different types. So we've got lamps here. So includes fluorescent lamps, neon, mercury vapor lamps. So, any of those bulbs, like that guy in the picture showing, or whoever that person is there with all those bulbs, that kind of stuff, it's universal waste. The biggest point with universal waste is how it's labeled. You really need to pay attention to how it's labeled. And if I send you an email saying it has to be labeled in this specific way, make sure you pay attention and actually label it like that, because these are the standards that are in the regulations, and we are held accountable for having these specific phrases on the labels, or else we could get a violation. So in the case of lamps, you can see it says universal waste lamps. If we had universal waste bulbs on there, that's wrong. That would be a violation. It has to say lamps. You'd want the date of initial generation on there, and those are the 2 biggest things that you would need to have on that drum. It's a universal waste label that says lamps and the date of generation, or the date you brought it back to your yard. We've got universal waste batteries. So this is any of the lead acid batteries, any of those AAA, AA, literally all batteries are under this universal waste rule. So that's pretty helpful because we can send all these to a recycler. We can pick them all up on a BOL. And you'd want to put them into, 5-gallon polys or 30-gallon polys. You just have to be careful with batteries, because they can get super duper heavy. So don't fill up a whole 55-gallon drum with AA batteries, or else it's going to be really hard to move. So you'd want to have a label on there that says universal waste batteries. It has to say that very specifically, and it has to have the date of initial generation. So you would need both of those things on there. And in the case of lead acid batteries, as a specific example, we really would need the DOT hazard sticker on there, which would be a corrosive sticker. Just because it's not regulated as a hazardous waste doesn't change DOT rules. If these are corrosive, may not be a hazardous waste for corrosive because it's a universal waste, but a DOT officer is still going to need to see that corrosive sticker on there. So these are all instructions that I will give when I know we're going to make a waste pickup, or if I know you've picked something up, that's a universal waste, then we'll tell you what DOT hazard label you'll need on there. But just something to pay attention to. Next one's pesticides. We don't really deal with those too much. I'm going to skip through that because those are pretty specific circumstances that, you don't really need to know about that. The other category, lamps. Oops, already did that one. But there's some more examples of lamps. And that's a lot. Most of the time we'll put those in bulk boxes, which are those long, thin, skinny boxes. The other category of universal waste are mercury devices. So this would be thermostats, barometers, pressure gauges, mercury switches, And we've once again got specific phrasing here. Universal waste, mercury thermostats. Has to say that. Has to have the date of generation or the day you brought it back to your yard. So just things to pay attention to, and why if I tell you something has to be labeled in a certain way, don't try and remix it. Like, it literally has to say exactly what I tell you it has to say on the label. And then this is a Texas-specific universal waste. So in Colorado, this does not apply. In Texas, they made a paint universal waste category. So it would be any mixture of pigment and liquid that forms a closely adherent coating when spread on a surface, or any material that results from painting activities. So it would be like used or unused paints, spent solvents in painting, PPE contaminated with paint, coating, waste paint, overspray, paint filters, paint sludges, cleanup residue, certain inks, aerosol cans of paint. These all are under the universal waste paint rule. So basically any type of paint that would have been hazardous, let's say it's flammable, let's say it's, got some type of listed hazardous waste in there, it's considered universal paint waste and is not considered hazardous waste in Texas. But like I said, this does not apply in Colorado. If you pick up flammable paint, it's flammable paint. It's not universal waste paint. So this is a Texas deal only. Important thing to remember, this does not include non-hazardous paints like latex paint and water-based paint. These are generally considered class 2 non-hazardous waste. Or if you're up in Colorado, just be non-hazardous waste. So, if you're on an HHW and you're trying to sort paints and you've got one latex paint can and then another, paint can of paint thinner, and you see that flammable diamond on there, then okay, well, it's got a flammable diamond. That means it's universal paint waste. The latex paint is fine. That can go to the landfill. That's not hazardous. So, and there is a distinction there. So it's important that you're paying attention and looking at labels, to make the right choice, of how you're sorting this stuff. So for universal waste, it must say paint and paint-related waste. So once again, a very specific phrasing. Has to have the date of initial generation, and it really should have a DOT hazard label. So you may have a universal paint waste sticker on that drum of aerosols, but you're also going to need a flammable gas sticker on there. So like I said, just because it's not hazardous waste doesn't mean it's not still considered hazardous in DOT rules and regulations. Okay, so now we'll go into annual waste training and waste record keeping. The waste record keeping in terms of the hazardous waste manifest. So we all know what the uniform hazardous waste manifest looks like, and it's required for generators who transport or offer for transport hazardous waste for offsite treatment, recycling, storage, and disposal. It's a paper document containing multiple copies of a single form. So if you look at a waste manifest, there's, I think there's 6 different pieces to it. I can't remember. There's a lot of flaps to it. They recently changed how many there were on there. Basically what that is so when you're filling it out, everybody gets a copy. The generator gets a copy. The transporter gets a copy. Transporter 2 gets a copy. The disposal facility gets a copy. And then the disposal facility actually mails back the final signed manifest to the generator. So there's a lot of copies that go around. Basically, everybody gets one. That's why it's a carbon copy. So it's really important that these are filled out fully, that they're filled out accurately, because like I said, everyone's getting a copy, and the last thing you want to do is screw it up. So technically the generator is responsible for filling out the manifest, but as we all know, a lot of times the generators don't know how to fill these out, or, one second, I need to get my dog. Hold on. Okay, I'm back. So like I said, most of the time we fill out that hazardous waste manifest for the generator before the pickup. I'm sure many of you have heard me gritch and moan, but we should never, ever, 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 ever plan a waste pickup if you haven't spoken with me first. Because if you go and pick up hazardous waste on a bill of lading That is a no-no. Like, I mean, we've got a problem because, first of all, you transported hazardous waste without a manifest, which is bad on DOT rules. And second of all, when you bring that waste back to the yard and you've got hazardous waste sitting there and no hazardous waste manifest, well, now we've got a regulatory issue and we could get a big fat violation for that. And that is a serious violation. So do not ever assume it's okay to go pick up hazardous waste without a waste manifest. Most of the time, I will send you exactly what you need to copy onto the manifest, because it's really important that it's all filled out. I mean, I worked for the TCEQ before I worked for CG. I know what they're looking for, and I've seen them give violations for even missing a phone number on there. So it's super duper important that, we do everything to a T when we are picking up hazardous waste that requires a hazardous waste manifest. So, like I said, you can see it here. In order to legally transport hazardous waste, a manifest is required. So this is required by the EPA and by DOT. So any hazardous waste manifest has to accompany all hazardous waste shipments. So it also has to accompany any Class 1 waste. So if you've got an industrial facility and we're picking up Class 1 waste, here, drop it. No. Oh, I'm so sorry. My rooster has it. He's got a sticky note in his mouth. Okay, anyways. Oh, he bit me. So any Class 1 waste from an industrial customer, once again, I will direct you on what you need to have for that. Most of our customers are non-industrial. Most of the time, it's fine to pick it up on a BOL. But if I tell you explicitly otherwise, please make sure directions are followed, because we are responsible for having this paperwork with the waste. If an inspector shows up on site, they will expect to see that manifest, corresponding to that waste. So it's just, that's why I harp on it so hard, is because it's one of the most important things. Okay, we don't really care about that. So all manifests have a manifest tracking number. So these are specific to that one manifest. No other manifest has that number on there. So you can see this is a manifest for Thurman, which is a big one of our customers that we pick up a lot of waste for in Austin. And they are an industrial generator. So any of their Class 1 waste or any of their hazardous waste, we have to pick it up on a manifest. And we have to have that manifest with that waste. So there you go. This is another example. This is bulk waste, soil and hydraulic oil that went to Turkey Creek. So this is a fully completed manifest. It may not be pretty, but it's got everything on here that is required. So that whole first section in green is really actually required, or the generator is required to fill all that out. But because we're acting on behalf of the generator, we fill all that out for them. So you can see that, we've got the name, we've got where it came from, so near the intersection of Highway US 80 and East Fork Road, Sunnyvale, Texas. So it's got all these just information on here. Who hauled it? Well, we did. So I put our name, our APA ID number, where it's going. You can see I put what type of waste, soil, hydraulic oil, the profile number. I signed on behalf of the generator. And then Chris, who hauled it here in DFW, he signed as transporter. And then once it got to the landfill, they signed as the disposal facility. So if you ever have a manifest and you're moving that waste on this manifest and you see, oh, I don't have a generator signature. Okay, well, you better get that, because you can't be moving that waste around and hauling it with an incomplete manifest. I recently saw, we had a job we did with another company and they filled out the manifest for us, which was a mistake, because they didn't even put, you see on there where I say non-hazardous, non-DOT regulated waste, soil, hydraulic oil, Class 1, like all that information, all of it was blank. And they were hauling that waste and actually hauled it to the landfill like that, that's not a good situation, because now we're going to have to go back and correct it in their system, and it's just a real pain. So please make sure that if you're hauling something and you're missing signatures, or there's clearly something missing, say something so we can fix it ahead of time and make sure that we're in compliance and that we've got everything that's regulatory required. The biggest thing a lot of times for the waste manifest, and I see this all the time and it happens all the time, I don't know how they regulate it, but really, if you don't have specific training for DOT hazmat transportation regulations, then you should not sign on behalf of the generator. So you see on there where I said on behalf of generator A Holovach/CG, and then I signed. Well, I'm okay to do that because I have that training. But let's say it's an office lady, there's like, some you go to do a pickup and it's like some random person. Really, they shouldn't be signing there. If you don't have that training, then you really shouldn't be signing there. So that's why it's important that, we make sure that you guys have the DOT hazmat transportation training, which is going to be attached to this presentation. I've got a couple videos and some more information that will help you guys through that training, so you are able to sign those manifests. But that's a point that a lot of people miss. In terms of record keeping for bills of lading, the BOLs that we all know, we all use BOLs all the time. You can use BOLs when you're hauling universal waste, so the batteries, the bulbs, in Texas, the paint, we can use that BOL. Class 1 waste that's going for recycling, so that would be, let's say we pick up absorbents, from an industrial customer and it's going into Turkey Creek. It's okay to pick that up on a BOL. Than any class 2 waste or class 3 waste. So, if you had a drum of animal grease, it's okay to pick up on a BOL. And we have to maintain our manifests, our BOLs, our training documents, all of it for a minimum of 3 years. So all of the waste classifications, analytical testing, manifests, and BOLs, we have to keep all that for 3 years. So if someone shows up to your facility and wants to do an inspection, they will ask for your past 3 years worth of waste documents, which most of the time I will be able to help you with that. Because we keep all that on the P drive, on the shared drive. So we've got all those, touch of a mouse, here they come. But that's why it's super important, if anyone ever shows up to your facility to do any type of inspection, whether it's a city person, EPA, state person, let me know and immediately call me and put me on the phone so I'm on speakerphone, because I don't want y'all trying to go through an inspection or audit without me present, whether it's on the phone or whatever. So just call me and we'll make sure that they get everything they need, because I know you guys don't keep on site 3 years worth of stuff because it's all sent into corporate. So just an important reason why you'd want to call me as soon as someone shows up. These are kind of some examples of some issues on manifests. And a lot of these, they were done correctly, but I just whited out what was there to show you an example of what could go wrong. So this is an example of a hazardous waste manifest, and we were hauling hazardous waste here. You can see that there was quite a bit of waste, but it would be a major issue if we hauled this and there was no generator name or signature. You can see I whited it out, but there have been times with like non-haz waste where, something shows up to the landfill and there's no generator signature. There's no behalf of generator, there's nothing. So we want to make sure that that's there. On a BOL, no gallon amount listed. So obviously that's a problem. We need to know, did you have a drum? Did you have 300 gallons? Did you have, whatever? So you want to make sure that that's properly filled out. Now this is one that you wouldn't normally notice. It's really a minute detail and not really important to the safe management of the waste. But like I said, I worked with the state and I've seen how nitpicky they can be. So you want to make sure that all of these things are covered. There was no generator phone number included. There was, I erased it, but let's say that there wasn't. So we're missing our, the phone number right there, which would be a violation because we are filling this out on behalf of the generator and we need to make sure it's correct. So, and it says right there, generator phone, right wrote Fort Worth, Texas. So just continue on, even if it's a hideous manifest. If it's got all the information on there, I don't care. It can be as ugly or, as many scribbles or whatever, as long as it's correct and as long as it's got all the information that's supposed to be there, then we're okay. And this is an example of a Republic manifest for waste that went to Testman. So you can see there it says US EPA ID number for the designated facility. If there was nothing written there, then that's going to be a problem. Not only will, you bet your booty Testman will throw a big fat fit, but, once we get this back and if we send it on to the generator and this is clear correct, they are industrial, they do report their waste to the state, this could be an issue for them if they went through an audit, which in turn would become an issue for us. So it's important to fill out every single box. It's asking you these questions for a reason. So, okay, now we'll run through labeling and management of waste containers. All containers of waste should be clearly labeled. So that includes generator name, the site address, when it got to your yard, so the date of generation, whatever day you brought it back to your yard, description of the waste that's inside or the hazardous waste shipping name, and that'll depend on the manifest. So, I would tell you specifically what would need to go there. If it's something that's outside the norm, just like soil and diesel or whatever, easily, just write that on there. It's also very helpful, although it's not required, it's super helpful if you write if it's part of a set. So if you've got 4 drums, you'd want to write 1 of 4, 2 of 4, 3 or 4, 4 of 4. And that way you've got a group of them and there's no stragglers that, hang around or get lost in the mix. So this is super duper important that you have everything properly labeled, because if an inspector shows up, this will be the first thing they look at. And if your drums are half-ass labeled and you've got, 2 words on the label, then there's going to be an issue, and you're going to open yourself up to more questions and more inquiry, and that's about the last thing we want. So just up front, label it fully and completely, and then, you'll be in the clear. Hey, so this is an example of a fully completed waste manifest or waste label. So you've got, the name, Harry's Auto Part Manufacturing, the address, full address, and the content. So latex paint absorbent. So that's non-haz. You said class 2, those latex paints, they're not hazardous at all. And then the date we brought it back to the yard. And so there it is. And Gus is getting really excited about this. This is an example of a fully filled out hazardous waste label. There is one part missing on here. So we'll run through it, and obviously you can see what's missing. We got the name, the address, we've got their EPA ID number, which not all of our generators will have an EPA ID number. There may be times it's a roadside cleanup. We're dealing with a trucking company. They don't report to the state. But then we've got some generators who, do report to the state. They do have an EPA ID number. They've got EPA waste numbers. They've, got specific codes to their facility that we would have to include on there. And I would tell you what those would need to be, depending on the circumstance. Accumulation start date. So when we brought it back to our yard, and that is super important for hazardous waste. We have to dot all our I's and cross all our T's with hazardous waste, because as a transfer facility, we can only have that stuff here on our yard for 10 days. If it goes over 10 days, we are in violation. And that is another a nasty one that we really don't want. That's not a small violation. That's a big violation. So if you have hazardous waste sitting on your yard for 12, 15, 20 days, we've got a major problem, and you would need to come and talk to me and make sure that it's something that didn't get missed. Most of the time we're good on that, because I know you have it there and we're working on moving it quickly. But, if there's something and you haven't heard from me and you're like, okay, what's going on? We're approaching 10 days, then let me know immediately so we can get it moving. And then what's missing on here is that manifest tracking number. So how I told you there's specific manifest numbers that are specific to each manifest. That's what would go there. So that way when we drop this drum off at Clean Harbors or wherever we're dropping it, they can easily match that drum with your waste manifest because it's got the number on there. And then the last section is the DOT proper shipping name. So this comes from our manifest, which, like I said, normally I will send to you with how to fully and completely fill that out. So before you go to pick up hazardous waste, you'd want to have not only your hazardous waste manifest ready that I've, told you how it needs to be filled out. You would also want to make sure that you've got this label ready with that DOT name on there, with, all of this other information on there. So as soon as you pick it up, you can slap this on there and call it good. And you're already ready to bring it back to your yard, and you're not going to forget about it. And now you've got unlabeled hazardous waste and blah, blah, blah. So picking up any haz, you just want to make sure you're 100% prepared. So these are all of the main classes that we deal with of DOT diamonds. So you can see we've got, it doesn't have class 9 on here, and it doesn't have corrosives on here. But these are generally what you'll see. You got flammable gas, you got flammable liquid, an oxidizer, poison. So if I tell you that you need to have a DOT diamond on there, this is what I'm talking about. So most of our pretty much all of our hazardous waste is not only going to have the haz waste label, it's also going to have one of these on there. which these are DOT required, and it is EPA required. And, Clean Harbors will send me nasty emails if we don't put these on there. So please make sure if I tell you to put these on there that they get on there. So there's an example of a lovely, fully labeled drum. It's only missing that manifest tracking number, but it's got a fully completed hazardous waste label almost. And then it's got the flammable solid DOT sticker, because this would be like gas and absorbance. Let's say it comes back hazardous for flammability, then this is how we would label it. Here's an example of a used oil absorbent label. So if I say we've got used oil absorbents and it's going to Midstate or Valacor for recycle, this is the label you would use. You would say used oil, you'd have all your information on there, the name and where it came from, and the contents, used oil absorbents, and then you'd want to have it sitting in containment. So that would be, there you go. That'd be a beautifully labeled drum, and it would be sitting in containment. Here's an example of a universal waste label. So this would be like if we had a lead acid battery. You can see I put universal waste batteries, the accumulation start date, so the date we brought it back to our yard, and then the shipper name and the address that we brought it from. So here is a lovely drum. It's a poly drum, which obviously you'd want to use for lead acid batteries because they are corrosive. You'd have a universal waste label fully filled out on there, and you'd have a corrosive diamond.
Stop that. Your bone.
Okay, so condition of containers. Most of the time this is a no-brainer, but there are times where I'll see people bring stuff back and I'm like, why would you ever transport that? So if it looks like those drums in the picture, smashed, dented, leaking, that is no bueno. All waste has to be packaged in accordance with DOT, EPA, and state regulations before being transported. Drums of liquids, don't ever fill them all the way up to the top. Give them a little bit of space, so fill them, 3/4 of the way up, but leave room, and that prevents leakage, that prevents any, off-gassing or bulging. So if you have any drums that you're going to go pick up and you see that they're leaking, you see visible staining, you see denting, creasing, ill-fitting drum rings, all of these things are going to require an overpack. So if there's any question and you're not quite sure what the condition of these drums are going to be, and before you pick them up, bring overpacks with you. So it's better to overpack it and charge the customer than it is to bring a drum looking heinous like that back to the yard, because now, you've put us at risk for a leak and spillage. You put us at risk, DOT-wise, because you transported it like that. So there's absolutely no harm in overpacking stuff. All it's going to do is keep us safe and keep us from having other issues down the road. And the disposal facility, at the end is not going to take it like that. They are going to overpack it, and then charge us more than we would have if we did it ourselves. So just pay attention. If it looks nasty, then overpack it. Just more examples, if there's any fuming, off-gassing. One big thing is that there's any old labels or markings on there, whether it's an old product label or an old waste label, make sure those are removed, or just put a piece of duct tape over it or something to indicate that label is no longer applicable. It's important. You don't want to have multiple conflicting labels on there where you're like, if an inspector showed up, they'd be like, well, is it this or that? Leave as few questions out there as possible. So just remove old labels and put those new fully completed ones on there. So choosing the correct container, just general rule of thumb, the plastic poly drums are obviously better for corrosive waste and liquid wastes. I like them better for liquid waste because I feel like they tend to leak, less chance that they're going to leak if you put it into a poly drum. And steel drums, good for pretty much everything, non-corrosive and flammable liquids, just not good for corrosive wastes, obviously. So there you go. Empty containers. Basically just says that labels and markings no longer apply, need to be removed or painted over. In the case of listed hazardous wastes, so, we discussed that earlier and how I said anything they touch become listed hazardous waste. Well, that applies to the empty drums as well. So even if we go to pick up drums from a customer and they used to hold listed hazardous waste, well, I'll ask you, has that drum been triple rinsed? And if you say no, or the customer says no, then, well, now that's hazardous waste. Maybe an empty drum, but it's hazardous. So, like I said, just more questions that I would ask you about empty drums It's never just as simple as, oh, we're picking up some empty drums. I'm always going to ask what was in there, so something to keep in mind. Okay, so I kind of Frankenstein this presentation together. Here we go. We're going to a different section now for facility inspection requirements. So like I said, CG, all of our locations, we are transfer facilities. So we are hazardous waste transfer facility. So we, can have hazardous waste here for 10 days. We're a used oil handler and transfer facility. So, any of these regulations we are responsible for adhering to. So the entire facility has to be inspected at least monthly. I have you guys inspect weekly, the yard. And we just recently, redid those inspection sheets so they're a little bit more thorough. And we have to maintain these logs for at least 3 years. So the logs have to have the date and time of the inspection, name of the inspector, observations made, and date and nature of any repairs. So when I'm asking for these and you're maintaining these, it's not because I'm just trying to be irritating. It's because this is something, once again, that an inspector would ask for, is to say, let me see all your inspection logs. And they will go through date by date. And if you're missing a week, then it's going to be a problem. So make sure you're doing these consistently each week and you're taking care of it once a month for the bigger checklist. So, okay, employee training requirements. That's what we're doing right now. So each year you guys have to have the RCRA training, the waste training. That's what we're doing right now. And you also have to have a contingency plan and SPCC training. So that's something that will come in addition to this that I already sent to most of the site supervisors, our updated contingency plans and SBC training. Basically, it doesn't really change that much year to year, but it's just an important reminder of what would you do in an emergency if there's a spill, who would you call, what would you do? So that's, an annual required training, and it's required for new hires as well. And we have to maintain all of y'all's training documents indefinitely. So if you're still an employee here, then we have to maintain all your documents for as long as you work here. So if you work here for 50 years, we'll have your training from 50 years ago, essentially. Okay, so now we've gone through all that. This is just some examples of some no-nos that have been seen in the past. These are all examples at the DFW yard, and these are all hideous. Most of these are from when I first started working here, and we had some major issues, but it's just good examples of if you see something like this, even on a minute level, then you need to say something and we need to get this corrected. So in this picture, you can see there were some frac tanks there that had been cleaned. The inside, we'd gone and cleaned them out. Well, obviously there's a dark stain leading away. So we need to pay attention to any discharges. Discharges are not acceptable. When you're cleaning a frac tank, if you're worried that there's going to be a discharge, then use a baby pole. Put a baby pole under that manhole. So anything that comes out is going to get captured. Then you can just suck it up when you're done, with the rest of your liquid waste. And if you do happen to have some type of little discharge, then you need to clean that up. It's not acceptable just to walk away and be like, oh, it'll dry up. Oh, that, it needs to be cleaned up. This is an example of a horrible looking secondary containment. So containment around frac tanks, containment around drums, totes, whatever, it needs to be maintained in good condition. So if it's smashed down or disfigured, it can't serve its intended purpose, which is obviously an issue. This would be the type of thing you'd be looking for in your weekly inspection log, your monthly inspection log. Are things that are set up to serve as secondary containment, are these in good condition? And if not, then you need to figure out how to fix it. So this is heinous. This is a roll-off. So if you see any standing oily water or just standing water in general, then you need to pump that and put it in oily water. It's just not acceptable to have standing oily water because the landfills don't want that. They'll turn us away. It could potentially, leak out of a hole of one of these roll-offs or dumpsters. So make sure that that's not taking place. So this is an example of when people just drop bags of waste. They may say, oh, it's late, it's absorbent, I'm tired. Okay, well, tough titties, you need to put it in a drum, and you need to label it. It's not cool just to drop bags like that and expect for someone else to figure it out later. So, not only are these not DOT acceptable containers, but bags aren't labeled. There's no way for anyone to know what's in there. So, it needs to take the extra 10 minutes, drag the drum out, put a label on it. Here's another example of a discharge from a frac tank. These are the rust chips that came out, and I guess whoever this was assumed it wasn't a big deal because, it was just rust chips, but that's still unacceptable, and if something happens where an inspector shows up, which they can show up at any time they want, they don't have to have an appointment, they can show up whenever, and they walk by and see this is horrible, and we need to make sure that's not happening. So drum it up, shovel it up. If there'd been a baby pool there in the first place, it wouldn't have happened. Could have been captured real easy. So this is an example of used oil or oily water out of containment. So our guys had filled up all the totes, I guess, at this point, and they needed some other place to put some oily water to offload. Well, they just dragged a tote over here and offloaded. You can't do that. That's a violation right there. It has to be in secondary containment. So, if you don't have any place to put it, your oily water, because you're full or whatever, then other arrangements are going to have to be made. It's not acceptable just to leave it there like that, whether it's just sitting in the middle of your yard, sitting on concrete, doesn't matter. It has to be in containment. These are hideous. Obviously, they should not be stacked, and they should not be unloaded on a random part of the yard. So somebody just pulled up and took all these off and was like, oh, that's fine. That's not fine. They should have been unloaded in the waste area. They should have been labeled properly, and they should not have been stacked. That's just like a spill waiting to happen. So this is not an acceptable form of storage. There was liquid waste in here, and I think it was like food grease or something. But still, that's, it was not labeled. And we can't just use a giant, horse pool, baby pool, whatever that thing is. That's not an acceptable way to store waste. And it may have a tarp over it or whatever, but that looks horrible. This is an example of dented drums that should have been overpacked. So as you can see, got that blue substance coming out the top. Not only were these overfilled, but they were dented, they were leaking, and now we've got it on the ground, and just not acceptable. And another thing that's not pointed out in here, you can see they had a universal waste label on there with the flammable liquid. That universal waste label was not filled out. So just because you put the universal waste label on there doesn't mean that that's good enough. Multiple things here. These drums are not DOT acceptable. They should have never been picked up like that. They're dented. They're missing, I guess the bung covers are sitting right there, but still, it shouldn't have been picked up like that. And it is oily water, which means we are regulating it based on used oil rules. So it has to be labeled as used oil. And ideally, whoever picked these up would have crossed through or taped over. We'll see where it says isopropyl alcohol. That's not in there anymore. Something needs to be done about that. So, an inspector wouldn't be confused and be like, is this oily water or alcohol? What is this? So, and then this is icing on the cake. This was horrible. This was the first couple of weeks I was working here, so 3 years ago. But I showed up and these containers were sitting here like that in the middle of the yard. Just heinous, and you can see there's a leak right there. I mean, it just was awful. So, once again, these are not acceptable waste storage containers. I don't care how busy you are or whatever's going on, that is not acceptable to leave something looking like that. Another example of used oil sitting out of containment. Great, it was labeled as used oil, but first of all, we don't know who the generator is. We don't know where this crap came from, and it's not in secondary containment. So, we've got a whole bunch of totes that were sitting there that, that was not acceptable. Another little discharge under there, bulging drum. This is an example of non-DOT acceptable drums. So don't be afraid, if you show up to a site and you were not aware that there were going to be, any heinous looking drums, just say, I can't pick that up right now. I'd rather have you come back, pick up an overpack, and we'll charge the customer accordingly because, we can't put ourselves at risk just because we feel pressured to pick up these drums. I mean, these are horrible looking. That one is totally bulged at the top. The one on the left has clearly had leaks, and does not look in sound condition. So these would, be things that would have to be overpacked, or you would not be able to pick them up at that point. Another example, it was an overfilled drum. They moved it, and then it all ended up sloshing on top, which, what are we supposed to do about that now? Now we've got a situation that's going to leak. It's going to discharge. So then now the next parts are going to be the annual hazmat transportation training and what's the other thing? Security plan training. So back here, the hazmat transportation training is basically this video, which I'll link to you guys, is going to be going through the different types of placards, and the requirements for when you need a placard and stuff like that. And once again, most of the time, our hazardous waste pickups are planned. And I will tell you, we're picking up 5 drums of acid. We have to have a corrosive placard. We have to have a hazmat, licensed CDL driver to pick this up. You wouldn't just want to send Joe Schmo out there to pick up 10 drums of, some type of flammable liquid and not have placards and not have a driver that's able to legally transport those materials. So that's what these videos are going to go through, is basically, what's required, when is it required, exposure to the different placards and stuff like that. But like I said, most of the time, this will be a discussion we have before you go pick up the waste, so that we know we've got a hazmat CDL driver, we've got placards, we've got a manifest. So don't ever assume, that it's okay to pick something up, just because someone told you to. If you haven't talked to me explicitly and you haven't seen those instructions and something doesn't seem right, then that's when you need to say, okay, maybe we can't pick this up yet. So really just, watch that video. And if you have any questions, let me know. But like I said, most of the time we will have these conversations before any of these things transpire. So, and then the last part is a security plan training, or hazmat security plan training. Just basically making sure we're transporting stuff safely and keeping in mind, if there was like some crazy terrorist who wanted to come, and steal our waste. I mean, we're not really dealing with the types of waste that a terrorist would want to pick up. But it's just something that's important for us all to have awareness of. So watch the videos and read through the hazmat security plan specifically for our sites, and let me know if you have any questions on that. That's the end of that. So if anybody has any questions about any of this, let me know. Most of it is, I know I ran through it pretty quick and it's a lot of information, but it's basically just stuff for you guys to keep in mind why I ask certain questions, why I request. Does the customer have analytical, or do we need to do it? Do they have a safety data sheet? How is this stuff generated? I need a specific process. It's why I tell you to label things in a certain way. So just remember this whole presentation. These are all things that go through my mind when we bring waste back to the yard or when we're planning to, because, there's a lot that goes into it. And I rely on you guys for the specific details in order to plan all this out. So it's a joint effort. But yeah, there we